You guys wrote this question down a few weeks ago. Why does the moon look different at different times? And we're finally going to wrap this up, and you should be able to answer this question by the end of today. We're going to start, though, with Derek from Veritasium going out and interviewing people about why they think the moon looks different at different times. Check it out.
Now, I've been around Sydney and I've asked people what causes the phases of the moon. And you know what they say?
How do we get the phases of the moon? Because of the Earth blocks the light that comes from the sun.
A full moon is basically where we're seeing the full circle of the moon reflected back to Earth. But the light is actually coming from the sun.
And the crescent, the crescents are caused by the shadows of the Earth from the sun onto the moon.
The phases of the moon, is that about the sun and the moon and the something goes in front of something?
The Earth's between the moon and the sun. We won't see the moon, and then as it goes around, the Earth gets out of the way, so more of the sun shines on the moon and we can see the moon, I think.
So let's try to resolve it. What really causes the phases of the moon?
Phases of the moon, we need to know a couple of things first. One is there's only one source of light in the solar system, and that's the sun. So at the centre of the solar system, it produces all the light. So both the Earth and the moon are half illuminated by that one source of light. As the moon moves around the Earth, our perspective on it changes, because sometimes we see just the unlit face of the moon when the moon is between us and the sun. That's a new moon. At other times we'll see the moon has moved around the Earth and we see the moon half illuminated and half dark. We'd call that first quarter. At other times still, when the moon has moved further around the Earth, we see the full illuminated face of the moon, and we call that full moon. But it's just because the moon is half illuminated by the sun, and it's our perspective on that half illuminated moon which gives the phases.
Why doesn't the Earth block the light when we're seeing a full moon? You know, if it's sun, Earth, moon, why doesn't the Earth block out the light so we can't see the moon?
You would think that would happen every full moon. You would think the moon would go through the Earth's shadow at every full moon. But in fact the moon's orbit is tilted slightly to the orbit of the Earth around the sun.
How much is it tilted?
By about 5 degrees. So virtually every full moon, the moon is moving just above or just below the Earth's shadow.
In your science journal, what we were going to do is paste a little handout that I had for everybody that has all of the phases on the moon, and you guys are going to get to write in what they are called. Instead, what you guys get to do is do your best to draw each one of these phases. You guys get to do a little bit of extra work because it's 2020. Why not? So what I want you to do is draw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 different phases of the moon. And we're going to go through and name them. But first, there's some words that you guys need to know. You may know some of them already. If you see the entire face of the moon, it's known as a full moon. If you see none of the moon, it's known as a new moon, which means we don't see any of the lit up part of the moon. If you see less than half, it's known as a crescent moon. If you see more than half, it's known as a gibbous moon. It's a weird word. Really only ever see it when talking about the moon. Gibbous means more than half. A quarter moon means exactly half of it is lit up. And all of a sudden, things start to get confusing. Because why don't they call it a half moon? The reason is that it doesn't have to do with how much of the moon is lit up. It's how far around in its orbit it is. And it's a quarter of the way around in its orbit. So a quarter moon is when half of the moon's surface is lit up. That would be this one right here, or this one right here. Waxing means that as time is going on, more and more of the moon is becoming visible. It's getting bigger. So this and this and this, these are all getting bigger. That is known as waxing. Waning means that there is less and less of the moon that is visible each night. So if the moon is getting smaller, or appearing to get smaller, as it is down here, that is known as waning. If you guys were to go out in the middle of the night and look at the moon, I want you guys to be able to recognize what phase of the moon it is. Is it waxing gibbous, waning gibbous, waxing crescent, waning crescent, new moon, full moon, quarter moon, third quarter moon? In order to do that, you need to remember the word doc, D-O-C. Doc is how I was taught to remember. And what you're actually looking for is the curve of the letter D. O would be a full moon, and then the curve of the letter C. So if the moon looks like the curve of the letter D, well, that means that it is getting bigger. It's the beginning of the moon cycle. So that's going to be a waxing crescent or a waxing gibbous. Then it gets to the full moon, which is right here. And then the moon is going to start to look, after the full moon, it's going to start to look like the letter C, where you see the left side of the moon. So it starts going from a new moon to a full moon. As it's getting bigger, known as waxing, on the right-hand side is lit up. And then once you have a full moon going to a new moon, the amount of the moon that you can see is getting smaller. The left-hand side of the moon is getting lit up. So with this little acronym DOC, if you are going towards a full moon, you're getting bigger, it's the right-hand side. If you're going away from a full moon, you're getting smaller, it's the left-hand side of the moon that's lit up. You're going to need to be able to do that for your quiz. If we were to go through each one of these, we're going to start with the one that you can't see any of the moon on. That's where the moon, here's sunlight. And so the sun is going to be over here somewhere. And half of the moon is always lit up. Half of the earth is always lit up. If the half that's lit up is facing away from us and we can't see any of it, we're going to only see the dark side of the moon. Well, we call that a new moon. If, as the moon goes in its orbit in this direction, the half of the moon that's lit up, we can see a little bit of it. We see what's known as a crescent moon. And because it's going from nothing to a little bit, it's waxing, it's getting bigger. When you are 1/4 of the way around in its orbit, we call that a quarter moon. Even though you can still see half of the moon's lit up surface, it's called a quarter moon. Then you have, it's getting bigger, so it's a gibbous, so it's a waxing gibbous. If you see all of it, full moon, that should be the easiest one. And now it's getting smaller, so it's going to be waning. This would be a waning gibbous. When you are 1/4, 2/4, 3/4 around in your orbit, you're at a 3rd quarter moon, and then you're only one left. You're getting smaller, so you're waning. You're a crescent if you're less than half lit up, and that is going to be a waning crescent. This little kitty cat wants to know why this happens. Why do we get different phases of the moon? It has nothing to do with the Earth blocking any sort of sunlight. That's called an eclipse. We've already talked about that. It has to do with two things. All right, the first one is that the sun is the only thing lighting up the moon. The moon does not create any of its own light. It's only reflecting light. The sun is always hitting the moon, and half of the moon is always lit up, just like Earth. And Earth, you have daytime and nighttime. The side of Earth that's facing the sun is lit up. The side that's not is dark. The moon is the same way. We have the sun shining light. Half of the Earth is lit up. Half of the moon is lit up. That never changes. You never get all of the moon lit up. You never get all of the Earth lit up. You never get less than half of the Earth lit up, and you never get less than half of the moon. You're also going to notice as this animation is going, it seems to change. And the reason is that as time goes on, you actually have the Earth orbiting around the sun. I couldn't get my PowerPoint to orbit and spin at the same time. So the reason that it seemed to kind of change which direction it was the lit up half was facing is because the Earth is orbiting. But half of the Earth is always lit up, half of the moon is always lit up. The second reason that these phases of the moon happen is the angle that we're looking at the moon changes. And it changes because the moon is orbiting around planet Earth. Okay? So as the moon orbits Earth, we are going to be looking at a different section of the moon that's lit up. Sometimes we're looking at a section that is not lit up at all. Other times, because of where the moon's located, we're looking at all of the lit up side. Sometimes we're looking at half of the lit up side. The orbit of the moon is the reason that the phases of the moon happen. Half of the moon is always lit up. Sometimes we can see all of that side, sometimes we can't see any. This is a little bit smoother of a animation. You can see that always and forever, half of the moon is lit up. Always and forever. Let me move my little, there we go. There's never less than half of the moon lit up. There's never less than half of Earth lit up. But as the moon is orbiting around, we are going to see a different amount of that lit up half. Sometimes we see all of it. Sometimes we see most of it. Sometimes we see half of it. Sometimes we see less than half of it. So it's the orbit of the moon and the angle that we're looking at, the lit up half, that causes the phases of the moon to happen. What we would do is turn off all the lights, and I would shine a flashlight on a little tiny moon, and you guys would get to see that depending on where the moon is located, you're going to see different amounts of the moon. We're not in class, so I did my best to get this to work with a webcam and the light on my phone. Here you go. As we go from a new moon to a full moon, we start off and we can see a crescent. It's getting bigger, so that is a waxing crescent. To a quarter moon, where we can see half of the lit up side. To a gibbous moon, where we can see more than half of the lit up side. You can see that as it's getting bigger, the side that is lit up, the crescent that is lit up, is in the shape of the letter D, a capital D, like at the beginning of the word dock. And now we have a quarter moon and a gibbous moon. When the sun is directly on the other side of Earth, you can see the entire thing, and we have a full moon. Here we have a gibbous moon, a third quarter moon, and a crescent moon. When the moon is passing between the sun and the earth, we have a new moon. After the new moon, you can see a little bit of a crescent moon. Here you can see the lit up half of the moon is in the shape of a C. Here you can see the lit up portion of the moon is in the shape of the letter D. I want you guys to notice in this drawing that half of the moon is always lit up. No matter where the moon is in its orbit, half of the moon, exactly half of it, is lit up from the sun. Just like half of the earth is always going to be lit up. We can also always see half of the moon, the half that is facing us. What changes is how much of that lit up side of the moon we can see. So if the moon is right here, we are looking at half of the moon, and that half of the moon happens to be all the way lit up, we're going to call that a full moon. If we are looking at this moon here, in this place in its orbit, we see the half that's facing us. Most of that is lit up, and a little bit is not. We're going to call that, getting smaller, a waning gibbous. Here, we see this half of the moon. Half of it is lit up, half of it is not. We see, looking at this moon from Earth, the left-hand side, because we're looking at it from Earth. The left-hand side is going to be lit up. This is what we would see. We call that a last quarter. If we see this side of the moon, right here, only a little tiny bit of the lit up side is visible. We see that as a waning crescent. Waning means it's getting smaller. If we don't see any of the lit up side, we call that a new moon. If the sun is over here, it's a possibility that we could be having a total solar eclipse right here. If we just see a little bit, again, of the lit up side, we call that a crescent. And now it's going from nothing to a little bit. It's getting bigger. We call that a waxing crescent. First quarter, waxing gibbous, back till you get to your full moon. I want you guys in your science journal to write one sentence to your future self. What do you think this photograph is trying to tell you. And then I want you guys to try to figure out what this little green section that is highlighted on this last illustration means. It's not on any of the other ones. Why would the makers of this illustration put this little green section right here? I want to see if you guys can figure that out. What moon phase is represented here? Remember, it's the left-hand side that is lit up, and more than half of the moon is visible. What do you think this one is? It's the right-hand side of the moon that's lit up, and less than half is visible. And finally, what do you think this one is? In your science journal, you should have something drawn similar to this. It would be an absolute shame if I let you use your science journal on your next quiz and you didn't have this.